A red wagon sat on a porch in Oak Park, Illinois for 31 years. Not as decoration, as a toy. A grandmother got it in 1962. Her daughter rode in it through the neighborhood in 1968. Her granddaughter loaded it with stuffed animals in 1989. The paint was chipped in 3 places. One wheel had a squeak that never went away no matter how many times someone oiled it. But when you pulled the handle, it rolled. Smooth, straight, true. At their peak, the Radio Flyer factory on Diversey Avenue in Chicago employed over 700 workers producing wagons so simple in concept and so relentless in execution that they became the default image conjured in the American mind when anyone said the words child's toy. Not trucks, not dolls, not bicycles. A red wagon. Steel. 4 wheels. A handle. That's it. That's the whole product. And for nearly a century, it was enough. Then the same forces that hollowed out every other piece of American manufacturing came for the little red wagon. Foreign competition, private equity interest, a catastrophic decision in the 1990s that nearly destroyed the company in a single afternoon. A product launch so spectacularly ill-conceived that it remains one of the most studied disasters in toy industry history. This is the story of how a Sicilian immigrant built an American icon, how that icon nearly vanished 3 separate times, and how the family that refused to let it die made a choice that saved everything, by doing something no major toy manufacturer had attempted in 30 years. They brought the work home. Antonio Pasin was 16 years old when he arrived at Ellis Island in 1914. He had $14. He spoke no English. He had a carpenter's apprenticeship behind him in Venice, Italy, and a letter of introduction to a distant relative in Chicago who turned out to have moved to Cleveland 2 years earlier. So Antonio Pasin was 16 years old, alone in Chicago, with $14, no English, no contacts, and no plan beyond the conviction that he had not crossed the Atlantic Ocean to fail. This is the part of the story that gets romanticized, because it happened a long time ago and because it ended well. But it's worth sitting with the actual circumstances for a moment. Chicago in 1914 was not a welcoming city for Italian immigrants. The neighborhoods were carved up by ethnicity, and the welcome extended to new arrivals from Southern Europe ranged from cool to actively hostile. Young Antonio took work where he could find it: dishwashing, day labor. He lived in boarding houses where he shared a room with 5 other men who also spoke no English. He saved money. Not quickly, not dramatically. He saved money the way a 16-year-old carpenter's apprentice saves money, which is slowly and with great discipline and at significant personal cost to every comfort that might otherwise have made his evenings bearable. By 1917, he had saved enough to buy a used woodworking set. He set up in a 1-room rented space and began making wooden wagons at night after his day job ended. He sold them on the street. Then he sold them to a hardware store. Then he sold them to 3 hardware stores. The wagons were good. Pasin made things the way his apprenticeship had trained him to make things, which was carefully and without shortcuts, because the man who taught him had explained that a piece of furniture built with shortcuts is a piece of furniture that will embarrass you at the worst possible moment. And the man who taught him had been right. What I find remarkable about this moment is what Antonio Pasin chose to name his operation. He called it the Liberty Coaster Company. He was 20 years old, an immigrant in a country that had not been especially kind to him, and he named his business after the concept he had traveled 4,000 miles pursuing: liberty. Not from any naive sense that he had achieved it yet. From the conviction that he was in the process of achieving it and that the process itself deserved to be commemorated in the name. That quality, the stubborn insistence on naming things for what you believed them to be rather than what they currently were, would show up again and again in the history of the company he was building. By 1923, Antonio Pasin had made enough money from wooden wagons to do something that would change everything. He bought a metal stamping press. The metal stamping press is not a romantic piece of machinery. It is heavy, loud, and dangerous. It costs more than most small manufacturers can afford. It produces results that would take a skilled woodworker days in a fraction of the time, and it produces those results consistently, with a uniformity that hand craftsmanship cannot match. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. Pasin had watched the automobile industry transform itself through stamped steel production. He had seen the price of a car fall as manufacturing techniques improved. He understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people who have no formal business training but excellent pattern recognition, that the future of consumer goods was in mass production, and that mass production required capital equipment. The wagons he began stamping from steel in 1923 were different from anything else on the market. They were red, not because red was chosen by a committee or tested in focus groups, but because Antonio Pasin liked red, and because red enamel paint was cheap and durable and visible from across a yard. The red was, in the most literal sense, an accident of economics that became an identity. He called the wagon the radio flyer. This requires explanation, because to modern ears it sounds like a product name invented by a marketing team, and it was not. It was 1930. The radio flyer name emerged from two obsessions of the moment. Radio was the great technology of the age, the thing that connected people across distances that had previously been unbridgeable, and aviation was the romance of the age, the Wright brothers still fresh enough in memory that flying felt like magic rather than logistics. Pasin put both words together and called his wagon the radio flyer, and in doing so accidentally created one of the most durable brand names in American consumer product history. In 1933, Pasin made a decision that would cement the company's place in American culture. The World's Fair was coming to Chicago. The Century of Progress Exposition, as it was officially called, was intended to celebrate 100 years of American technological advancement. Pasin built a wagon 15 feet tall and displayed it at the fair. It was called the Coaster Boy. It was absurd. It was wonderful. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people saw it. Sales doubled the following year. Antonio Pasin understood something about American consumer culture that took most of his competitors decades to figure out. People don't just buy products, they buy products they've seen. They buy products that have been enlarged to mythological scale and presented to them as objects deserving of attention. The Coaster Boy wasn't advertising exactly. It was something more powerful. It was permission. It told every parent who saw it that buying a radio flyer wagon was not merely an acceptable choice. It was the obvious, correct, historically validated choice. The choice made obvious by an object 15 feet tall, gleaming red under the Chicago sun. By the late 1930s, the Radio Flyer factory on Diversey Avenue was one of the largest toy manufacturing operations in America. The workforce numbered in the hundreds. The production line ran 6 days a week. The steel came from mills in Gary, Indiana, 40 miles away. The paint came from suppliers in Chicago. The handles, the axles, the wheels, all sourced within a radius that in retrospect reads like a geography lesson in the American industrial ecosystem at its peak. This is the thing about manufacturing in its golden era that's easy to lose sight of when you look at the numbers. The factory wasn't just employing the people inside it. The factory was sustaining an entire web of suppliers, contractors, and service providers. Every radio flyer wagon that came off the Diversey Avenue line represented not just the labor of the workers who built it, but the labor of the steel mill workers who made the material, the paint factory workers who made the finish, the truckers who moved the components, the machinists who maintained the equipment. The factory was an economic ecosystem, and the radio flyer was the keystone species. During World War II, the metal that had been going into wagons went instead into the war effort, specifically into ammunition boxes and military equipment. Radio Flyer, like every other American manufacturer capable of adapted. They produced what the war required and waited for the war to end. It ended, and what followed? The post-war baby boom, the explosion of suburban development, the sudden appearance of millions of backyards in need of filling, was the best possible environment for a company that made the world's most recognizable outdoor children's toy. Antonio Pasin, now in his late 40s, watched his company become something he had probably not imagined when he was washing dishes in Chicago rooming houses. Radio Flyer became a cultural institution, not in the self-congratulatory way that brands sometimes claim institutional status, in the actual way where the product shows up in movies and television shows and songs as shorthand for a particular kind of American childhood. The Radio Flyer wagon didn't represent anything complicated. It represented exactly one thing: a child, a summer afternoon, an open street, that's it. And that simplicity, that utter resistance to any more complex meaning, turned out to be a form of profound cultural staying power. Antonio Pasin died in 1990. He was 91 years old. He had run his company for over 70 years. He had survived the Depression, 2 world wars, the Korean War, Vietnam, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the emergence of Japanese manufacturing competition, the invention of television as a toy marketing channel, and approximately 47 attempts by various parties to convince him that the little red wagon concept had run its course and perhaps Radio Flyer should diversify into something more current. He had declined all of these suggestions. His son Mario had been running the company since the 1980s, and when Antonio passed, Mario Pasin and his brother Robert became the stewards of what their father had built. They were, by all accounts, deeply aware of the responsibility this represented. They were also, as they would shortly discover, facing a set of challenges that their father's stubbornness had not fully prepared them for. Because by 1990, the toy industry had changed in ways that were structural, not cyclical, ways that didn't fix themselves when the economy improved. The changes had started in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s. The fundamental shift was the same one that had devastated Tonka, would later devastate countless other manufacturers. Cheap, injection-molded plastic from overseas manufacturers had undercut American steel goods on price to a degree that was difficult to fight with any amount of efficiency improvement. A Radio Flyer wagon in 1985 cost approximately $40. A competitor's plastic wagon cost $18. Both carried children across driveways. Both had 4 wheels and a handle. The parent who understood quality would pay the premium for the steel wagon. The parent standing in Kmart on Christmas Eve with $40 budgeted for the wagon gift would buy the plastic one. Mario Pasin knew the numbers. He knew they were moving in the wrong direction, and he knew, from conversations with buyers at every major retail chain, that the question was no longer whether Radio Flyer would face pressure on price. The question was how far that pressure would go and how long the brand premium could absorb it. The answer, it turned out, was not long enough. Here is where the Radio Flyer story diverges from every other American manufacturing story of this era, and the divergence happens because of an event that could have ended the company permanently. In 1997, Radio Flyer made a product called the Town & Country wagon. The Town & Country was an attempt to modernize the classic wagon design with additional features: a canopy for shade, raised sides for safety, a storage compartment, cup holders. The marketing concept was straightforward. Parents who bought the classic wagon for nostalgia reasons now had children of their own. Those parents wanted the nostalgia but also the features that modern parenting culture had made non-negotiable: shade, safety, storage. The Town & Country would give them both. The design team worked on it for months. The engineers reviewed it. The safety testing department reviewed it. Nobody noticed the problem with the canopy support structure until after the wagons were in stores. The canopy, when fully extended, created a pivot point that, under specific conditions, a child leaning sideways, a wagon going over uneven ground, could cause the canopy to collapse inward toward the child in the wagon. The force generated was not trivial. The Consumer Product Safety Commission received reports. The injuries were real. They were not catastrophic, but they were real, and they were documented, and they were caused directly by a Radio Flyer product. The company had to issue a recall. 12 million Town & Country wagons were recalled. 12 million. For a company with annual revenue in the range of $100 million, a 12 million unit recall represented a liability that was existential in scale. The lawsuit exposure alone could have consumed the company's assets entirely. The regulatory response could have imposed restrictions that made future product development impossible. And the brand damage. This is the part that's hard to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Radio Flyer's entire value proposition, the single most important thing the name represented to consumers, was safety. Not just safety in the sense of regulatory compliance. Safety in the deep emotional sense that parents meant when they said the wagon had been in the family for 3 generations. You give a child a Radio Flyer because you know nothing bad will happen. That is the promise. The Town & Country recall did not just injure children, it injured the promise. Mario Pasin made a decision in the aftermath of the recall that deserves more credit than it typically receives in accounts of this period. He did not minimize. He did not use legal language designed to acknowledge nothing while appearing to acknowledge something. He did not treat the recall as a crisis communications problem to be managed. He treated it as a moral failure to be corrected. The company settled claims, it redesigned the product, it instituted testing protocols that went significantly beyond what regulatory requirements demanded, and Mario Pasin went on record, in interviews and in company communications, acknowledging that Radio Flyer had failed to protect the children its products were supposed to serve, and that this failure was the company's responsibility, and that the company's response would be measured not in press releases, but in what the products they built going forward actually did. This is not how most companies respond to product liability crises. Most companies respond the way insurance lawyers advise them to respond, which is to say as little as possible that could be construed as admission of fault while moving as quickly as possible through the legal process toward a settlement that closes the matter. The approach is rational from a liability minimization standpoint. It is catastrophic from a brand recovery standpoint because consumers, who are not stupid, can tell the difference between a company that admits it failed them and a company that is managing its exposure. Radio Flyer survived the recall. It survived because the brand had sufficient equity to absorb the blow, but only barely. It survived because the family that owned it was willing to pay the cost of genuine accountability rather than the cheaper cost of managed PR. And it survived, paradoxically, because the recall happened before the internet had fully evolved as a mechanism for collective consumer grievance. If the Town & Country recall had happened in 2010 instead of 1997, the outcome might have been different. The recovery from the recall took years. During those years, the competitive environment did not pause to allow Radio Flyer to heal. It intensified. By 2000, the Chinese manufacturing model had fully matured as a threat to American toy producers. It was not merely that Chinese manufacturers could produce cheaper goods. They could produce cheap goods at the quality level required for the mass market. The gap between American-made and Chinese-made had narrowed from a canyon to a crack. Parents who bought a plastic wagon from a Chinese manufacturer in 1995 had found it to be somewhat inferior to the Radio Flyer. Parents who bought one in 2001 found it to be mostly adequate. Mostly adequate is one of the most dangerous competitive positions you can occupy. It means you're not getting replaced today, but you're getting replaced. Robert Pasin, Mario's nephew, Antonio's grandson, had joined the company in 1997, the year of the recall. He had grown up watching his grandfather run the business with the specific confidence of a man who had built it from nothing and trusted his own judgment about what it needed. He had watched his father and uncle navigate the pressures of the 1980s and 1990s. He arrived at the company at the exact moment it was facing the worst crisis in its history and needed, simultaneously, to resolve that crisis and figure out how to survive a competitive environment that was systematically eliminating American toy manufacturers one by one. Robert Pasin was 27 years old. He had an MBA. He had the full weight of his family's history pressing down on his shoulders with a force that was probably not calculable in conventional units of pressure. He went to work. What Robert Pasin understood, in a way that distinguishes him from most people who inherit family businesses and attempt to modernize them, is that the Radio Flyer brand was not just a marketing asset. It was a specific promise made to a specific type of consumer, a parent who remembered the wagon from their own childhood and wanted to give that memory to their children. This consumer was not primarily motivated by price. They were primarily motivated by authenticity. They wanted the real thing, not a cheaper version, not a modernized version that retained the name but abandoned the substance. The actual Radio Flyer, the wagon that was what it had always been. The problem was that to deliver that promise, Radio Flyer needed to make a product that could compete on price with Chinese-manufactured alternatives. And to compete on price, every analyst, every consultant, every investment banker who ever looked at the company's financial structure had the same recommendation: move production to China. The math was not subtle. American manufacturing labor costs were 8 to 12 times higher than comparable Chinese labor. The steel, sourced domestically, cost more than steel sourced through Chinese supply chains. The regulatory compliance costs, the benefits costs, the overhead costs of the Diversity Avenue facility, every line item pointed in the same direction. Move production to China, maintain the brand, harvest the premium. This is the Hasbro Tonka playbook. This is what happened to nearly every American consumer goods brand that faced this exact calculation in the 1990s and 2000s. The brand survives, the manufacturing doesn't. The promise changes even if the name stays the same. Radio Flyer made this decision. In 2001, the company moved wagon production to China, and for approximately 12 years it worked. The margins improved, the price points became more competitive. The brand held. Parents who bought a Radio Flyer in 2005 or 2008 were buying a Chinese-manufactured product with an American name, but the name still carried enough weight that they felt good about the purchase. The wagons were adequate, not as heavy as the old ones, not as precisely fitted, but red and four-wheeled and bearing the Radio Flyer name. If the story had ended here, it would be a story about a company that made a rational economic decision to survive, an honorable story about pragmatism in the face of forces too large to resist. The little red wagon going the way of the little steel truck and the little American guitar. But the story didn't end here. Robert Pasin, who had become CEO in 2000, was watching something in the data that made him uncomfortable. Not the sales numbers, which were fine, the customer feedback numbers. The parents who were buying Radio Flyer wagons in the 2000s were reporting satisfaction rates that were good, not great, good. The word good in a customer satisfaction report about a product whose core value proposition is nostalgia and authenticity is not actually good. It's concerning, because the parents who bought a Radio Flyer in 1985 had reported satisfaction that wasn't measured in percentage points. It was measured in the fact that they kept the wagon for 30 years and gave it to their children. The Chinese-manufactured wagons were not being kept for 30 years. They were being replaced. This distinction matters enormously and is worth pausing on. A product that creates lifetime loyalty generates a different kind of economic value than a product that creates repeat purchases. The Radio Flyer model historically had been built on lifetime loyalty. Parents bought one wagon. They kept it forever. They told everyone about it. The replacement rate was essentially zero, and the word of mouth was essentially infinite. The Chinese-manufactured model was generating replacement purchases, which looks good in annual revenue reports but is actually a warning sign. It means the product isn't delivering what the brand promised. It means the premium is being eroded, slowly and invisibly, in the gap between what consumers expect and what they receive. Robert Pasin understood this. He understood it in the way that people who grew up with a product in their family understand things, not through data analysis alone, but through the felt sense of what the product was supposed to be, and the growing awareness that what they were now selling wasn't quite that. He began talking about a decision that, by any conventional business metric, was insane. Bringing manufacturing back to Chicago. The conversations inside Radio Flyer about reshoring, the industry term for returning manufacturing to American facilities, were not simple. They were not quick. They were not comfortable. The people who ran operations understood the numbers, and the numbers were unambiguous. An American-made Radio Flyer wagon would cost significantly more to produce than a Chinese-made one. The retail price would have to reflect that cost increase, or the margins would be unsustainable. A retail price increase would reduce volume. Reduced volume would reduce the scale economies that made any manufacturing operation viable. The circle seemed impossible to square. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. What changed the calculation was two things happening simultaneously in the early 2010s. First, Chinese manufacturing costs were rising. The labor cost advantage that had made offshore production so attractive was narrowing as Chinese wages increased, as energy costs in China rose, as the Chinese government's management of its currency became more complicated. The gap between American manufacturing costs and Chinese manufacturing costs was still substantial, but it was no longer a canyon. Second, and more importantly, something was happening in American consumer culture that the data about satisfaction rates had been pointing toward for a decade. A subset of American consumers, not a majority, but a meaningful and affluent subset, had begun actively seeking out American-made products and paying premium prices for them. Not out of nationalism exactly, out of a specific response to the experience of buying things that broke, that disappointed, that delivered adequate when they'd been promised excellent. The craft beer movement, the farm-to-table restaurant movement, the artisanal goods market. All of these were expressions of the same underlying consumer sentiment. We will pay more for something genuinely made by people who care about what they're making. The premium is not just for the product, it's for the story, for the knowledge that the thing you're buying is the thing it claims to be. Robert Pasin saw this. He had been watching it for years, and he made a decision that required simultaneously enormous confidence and enormous humility. Confidence, because reshoring was going against every economic model that every consultant and every banker had presented. Humility, because doing it right would require admitting that the previous 12 years of Chinese manufacturing had been, in a specific sense, a betrayal of what the company was supposed to be. In 2013, Radio Flyer announced it was bringing the production of its premium wagon line back to Chicago. Not all production, not immediately, but the flagship product, the classic red wagon, the direct descendant of the wagon Antonio Pasin had been stamping out of steel on Diversey Avenue since the 1920s. That wagon was going to be made in America again. The factory they built was not the factory of 1960. That factory is gone, absorbed into the general reorganization of Chicago's industrial landscape that occurred over 40 years of deindustrialization. The building that replaced it, the Radio Flyer manufacturing and design facility, is modern in ways that Antonio Pasin would not recognize, and in ways that he absolutely would. He would not recognize the robotics, the automated welding systems that can lay a perfect bead of steel in 0.3 seconds, the computer-guided cutting machines, the quality sensors that detect deviations measured in thousandths of an inch. The facility is a 21st century factory, and it looks like one. He would recognize the steel. He would recognize the powder coating line, which applies the red enamel in a process more sophisticated but functionally similar to what his workers were doing in the 1940s. He would recognize the care, the way the finished wagons are inspected before they leave the building, the way the workers talk about the product, not as units of production, but as things that will end up in families. There is a culture in manufacturing facilities that you can feel before you understand it. It's related to pride, but it's more specific than that. It's the understanding that the thing you're making will outlast you, and that this fact is not intimidating but validating. You build something that lasts, and your work lasts with it. You build something disposable, and when it's gone, you're gone with it. The workers in the restored Radio Flyer Chicago facility have that culture. You can find it in interviews with plant workers from this period, in accounts from journalists who visited the facility when the reshoring announcement was made. People describing their work with a specificity and satisfaction that you don't hear from workers on a line producing disposable goods. They're making the wagon that their parents had, the wagon that will outlast the children who ride in it. The economics of the reshored production were exactly as complicated as the skeptics had predicted, and exactly as manageable as Robert Pasin had insisted they would be. The American-made classic red wagon retailed for approximately $99 when it relaunched in the American-made configuration. The Chinese-manufactured equivalent was available for significantly less. Some consumers chose the cheaper option. More consumers, particularly the demographic Radio Flyer, had identified as its core. Parents aged 25 to 45 with household incomes above $75,000, disproportionately likely to value authenticity in American manufacturing, chose the American-made version. The decision to reshore was not immediately profitable in the conventional sense. The startup costs of reconfiguring the facility, retraining workers, rebuilding the supply chain for American-sourced materials, all of this cost money that the financial models showed would take years to recoup. This is not a surprise to anyone who has ever tried to rebuild a manufacturing capability after dismantling it. Dismantling is fast, rebuilding is slow. The institutional knowledge that took decades to accumulate doesn't reappear in the first quarter after you decide you want it back. But something happened in the market that made the financial case more quickly than the models had predicted. The American-made Radio Flyer became a story, not just a product, a story. In an era of relentless offshoring, a company voluntarily bringing production back to Chicago was news. It was covered by the New York Times, by the Wall Street Journal, by every major business publication, by regional press throughout the Midwest, by the trade publications that covered manufacturing and retail and consumer goods. The coverage was almost uniformly favorable. Because the story Radio Flyer was telling, an American icon returning to its roots, a family business choosing community over margin, a great-grandfather's dream being honored by his great-grandson, is the kind of story that American media is structurally incapable of not loving. The coverage generated awareness. The awareness generated sales. The sales generated the data that Robert Pasin had been hoping to see, repurchase rates falling and satisfaction rates climbing. Because when you buy something well-made and it doesn't disappoint you, you don't need to replace it, and you tell everyone. There is a coda to this story that the business press covered less thoroughly than the reshoring announcement, but that matters as much for understanding what Radio Flyer has become. In 2016, the company launched a line of battery-powered ride-on vehicles, electric wagons essentially. Vehicles with rechargeable batteries and adjustable speed settings and remote parental controls. Products that the classic wagon collector community regarded with immediate suspicion, and the parents of 3-year-olds regarded with immediate interest. The launch was handled differently from how, say, the town and country canopy system had been handled. It was handled differently because the company had learned at enormous cost what happens when you rush a product to market without resolving every safety concern, and it had learned what happens when you respond to a crisis with management rather than accountability. The electric vehicles were tested extensively. Their safety record is excellent. They have expanded Radio Flyer's market into categories that the classic wagon never reached. Children who don't yet have the coordination to walk beside a pulled wagon, parents for whom the powered vehicle is a practical solution to specific mobility situations, and critically, they didn't replace the classic wagon, they sat alongside it. The catalog now contains both the American-made steel wagon that Antonio Pasin would recognize, and the battery-powered vehicle that he absolutely would not. Both carry the red logo, both carry the name, and the brand, which survived a recall and an offshoring and a reshoring and 3 generations of family succession, seems stable in a way it hasn't been since before the town and country. In 2021, Robert Pasin gave an interview in which he was asked about the decision to reshore manufacturing. He said something that is worth quoting, or at least paraphrasing closely, because it captures something true about what Radio Flyer had gone through and what it had learned. He said the decision was not primarily financial. The financial case could be made, but it could also be argued against, and smarter people than him had argued against it. The decision was about what the company was. Radio Flyer was not at its core a brand management operation that happened to have its name on wagons. It was a manufacturing company that happened to have a famous brand. The brand existed because of the manufacturing. The moment you forgot that, you were in the business of consuming a legacy rather than building one. His great-grandfather, Antonio Pasin, had understood this without ever articulating it. He built things. He built them carefully, in Chicago, with steel, for children. That was the whole of it. There was no layer of abstraction between the building and the purpose. When Radio Flyer separated itself from the building, when the wagons became a Chinese manufacturer's output with an American label, it had separated itself from the thing that made the brand worth owning. Coming back was not a marketing decision, it was a decision about identity, about what the company was willing to say it was. The Diversey Avenue neighborhood in Chicago has been through several lives since Antonio Pasin set up his metal stamping press in 1923. The specific building where he began is long gone. The broader industrial corridor that once housed dozens of manufacturers has contracted and transformed and in some places been replaced by the kind of mixed-use residential development that urban planners love and former factory workers regard with the particular blankness of people watching the place they spent their careers be turned into condominiums. The Radio Flyer facility that exists today is not the original. It is newer, cleaner, better lit, and occupied by fewer people doing more with modern equipment than the original workforce did with the tools of their era. This is not a failure. This is what manufacturing looks like when it survives long enough to modernize. And the wagons that come out of it are red, steel, 4 wheels, a handle. Some of them now have wood panel accents that Antonio Pasin definitely did not specify and would probably find unnecessary. Some of them have cup holders, which he would find baffling. The handle on the premium models has a pivot design that allows tighter turns, which he would appreciate. All of them, when you pick one up, have weight. Not oppressive weight. The weight of something made from steel, which is heavier than plastic because it is not plastic, and which communicates through that weight the specific message that steel goods have always communicated. This was not made cheaply, and it was not made to be thrown away. There are things this story teaches, and they are not entirely comfortable. The first is about the limits of financial logic as a guide to identity decisions. Radio Flyer's decision to offshore production in 2001 was financially rational. Every number supported it. The advisors were right that it would improve margins, and it did. They were also right that the brand was strong enough to survive the quality degradation, and it was. What they couldn't model, what no financial analysis can model, is the erosion of meaning that occurs when a product stops being what its name claims it is. The erosion is slow. It doesn't show up in quarterly reports. It shows up in the gap between what customers say they feel about a product and what they actually do with it. It shows up in the satisfaction rate that says good when it used to say irreplaceable. The second is about the particular vulnerability of products whose value is anchored in memory. Radio Flyer's brand power came from the fact that multiple generations of American families had genuine emotional relationships with the physical object, not with the name, with the object. The steel wagon that lasted decades and sat in garages and traveled to new houses and got passed to new children, that object was the anchor. When the object changed, when it became lighter, less precisely fitted, made from materials that communicated impermanence, the anchor dragged, slowly. But it dragged. The third is about what reshoring actually requires and why so few companies attempt it. It is not just a matter of building a new factory, it is a matter of rebuilding institutional knowledge that was lost when the factory closed. The workers who knew how to do the work are older, or retired, or working somewhere else. The supply chains for American-sourced materials have atrophied. The management systems that knew how to run American manufacturing have been replaced by management systems that know how to run procurement relationships. Rebuilding takes longer than dismantling took, costs more than the models predict, and requires a type of organizational patience that is genuinely rare in an era defined by quarterly earnings pressure. Radio Flyer could attempt this because it is a private, family-owned company. It answers to no public shareholders. It has no institutional investors requiring returns on a timeline that precludes long-term investment. The decision to reshore was made by a man whose great-grandfather built the company with his hands, and who understood at a level that can't be entirely explained by business logic that some things matter more than margin. This is not a model easily replicated by a publicly traded company. It is barely replicable by a private one, but it is possible. The wagon in your garage, if you have one from before 1965, heavy and red and squeak-free after 50 years, is evidence that it was possible once. The wagon in the current Radio Flyer catalog made in Chicago is evidence that it is possible again. Antonio Pasin's great-grandson Robert was asked, in an interview from 2019, what he thought his great-grandfather would make of the company today. The question was probably meant to invite a warm anecdote about immigrant ambition and American success. What he said instead was something more interesting. He said his great-grandfather was not sentimental about things, he was pragmatic. He made wagons because there was a market for wagons and he was good at making things. The red color was an economic choice. The Radio Flyer name was an observation about what people in 1930 found exciting. The 15-foot coaster boy at the World's Fair was a calculated bet on public spectacle as advertising. None of it was romantic in the moment it was happening. It was problem-solving. What his great-grandfather would recognize, Robert Pasin said, was not the nostalgia, it was the approach. Someone found a problem. They built something to solve it. They built it carefully, with good materials, in a place they knew well, for people they understood. And then they kept building it. Day after day, year after year, with the same care, until the thing they were building became something that outlasted them. That's not a brand strategy. It's barely a business strategy. It's closer to a philosophy. The little red wagon almost died 3 times. Once in the 1990s when overseas competition nearly made the classic steel wagon economically unviable. Once in 1997 when a product failure tested whether the company would respond with integrity or with management. and once in the 2001 to 2013 period when it had separated itself from its own manufacturing and was in the process, slowly and without anyone quite naming it, of becoming the kind of brand that harvests legacy rather than earns it. It survived all three because someone in the family at the moment of decision chose the harder thing. The thing that cost more, took longer, required admitting failure, required patience that the market would not have imposed. The wagons that come out of Chicago today will be in families 30 years from now. Some of them will be passed to grandchildren. Some will have squeaks in one wheel that nobody ever quite gets around to fixing. When a child pulls one down a sidewalk on a summer afternoon, the sound it makes, the specific metallic rolling of steel wheels on concrete, is the same sound it made in 1955 and the same sound it made in 1933 and approximately the same sound it made when Antonio Pasin rolled the first one out of his rented one-room shop in 1917 and sold it to a hardware store on Diversey Avenue. Some things, when built correctly, refuse to stop. That is the whole story. And unlike the steel trucks of Mound, Minnesota, and the guitars of Fullerton, California, and the candy wafers of Cambridge, Massachusetts, it hasn't ended yet. A Radio Flyer Classic Red Wagon, American-made, retails today for approximately $109. It weighs 12.5 pounds. It is made from steel. It comes in red. It has a handle. When you pull it, it rolls. It will outlast the child who rides in it. Antonio Pasin would recognize it immediately. He'd probably suggest it costs too much. Then he'd pull it around the parking lot twice and say it rolls straight and go back inside to work. Preparing and narrating stories like these takes a lot of effort and hard work, so if you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing.